Imagine boarding a flight, expecting a routine journey, only to find your world upended in the span of minutes. Naomi Sinclair, a poised and brilliant black CEO, takes her rightful first-class seat, a space she earned through vision, sweat, and undeniable talent. But, in an instant, a wealthy white passenger claims her seat as if privilege alone entitles him, triggering a chain of events no one could have anticipated. How far would someone go when power, bias, and entitlement collide at 30,000 feet? How do you stay composed when every eye is on you, yet injustice looms unchecked? Naomi's inner calm and quiet authority are put to the ultimate test, while the crew, caught between protocol and morality, must decide where their loyalty truly lies. This isn't just a story about a stolen seat. It's a story about dignity under pressure, the silent strength of a person refusing to be erased, and the subtle, often shocking, dynamics of systemic bias that surface in the most unexpected moments. Join us as we unravel this high-stakes, emotionally charged Flight 1 that will make you question your assumptions, reflect on courage, and witness justice unfold at cruising altitude. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and stay with us as Naomi's story begins. Flight 227, bound for Los Angeles, was boarding steadily that Thursday afternoon. The terminal was alive with the usual hum of business travelers juggling calls, families corralling children, and the occasional backpacker weaving through the crowd with wide-eyed curiosity. But inside the first-class cabin, where the air smelled faintly of leather and citrus polish, a calm elegance prevailed. Seat 2A was already occupied. Dr. Naomi Sinclair sat with poise that made the wide-bodied jetliner feel more like her private study than a commercial aircraft. At 44, she carried herself with an authority that didn't need to announce itself. Her cobalt silk blouse caught the glow of the overhead light, while a pair of understated diamond studs framed her face. A leather-bound planner rested in her lap, and her Mont Blanc pen hovered above the page as if words arrived to her in deliberate rhythm. For Naomi, silence was strategy. She had learned long ago that stillness could disarm far more effectively than shouting. In boardrooms, in negotiations, even in moments of insult, she had discovered that composure unsettled people who thrived on dominance. Yet, as she settled into 2A, she felt the familiar churn of thoughts. Would this flight, this tiny bubble of hours between New York and Los Angeles, offer her the peace to refine tomorrow's acquisition pitch? Or would the universe once again test her patience in ways she had grown both weary of and sharpened by the answer revealed itself quickly? A shadow fell across her aisle. A man in his early 50s, thick around the middle, with flushed cheeks and a golf shirt stretched past its prime, loomed above her. In his hand, a crumpled boarding pass fluttered like a white flag that thought itself a sword. His fingernails tapped the armrest of her seat with the irritation of someone already convinced of injustice. "Excuse me," he said, his voice pitched loud enough to command the attention of nearby passengers. "What in God's name do you think you're doing in my seat?" Naomi didn't flinch. Her pen traced a neat period at the end of a sentence. She exhaled slowly through her nose, her eyes fixed on the planner before her. It was a familiar crossroads, the instant she recognized when another person's ego was about to write a check reality couldn't cash. The man's face grew redder. "This is 2A, he insisted, waving the wrinkled pass inches from her shoulder. "I paid good money for this seat." A few rows back, heads turned. Conversation softened into whispers. The ambient hum of the cabin shifted, electric with the anticipation of conflict. Naomi felt it, the way oxygen thickens before a thunderstorm. She pressed her lips together. Should she meet his eyes? Should she answer? Or would silence, once again, be her sharpest weapon? She turned a page instead. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but its calm finality grated against his agitation. "Look, lady," the man boomed, puffing out his chest. "I don't know what kind of game you're running, but I'm not about to let someone sneak into first class because they think the rules don't apply." His words, dressed as authority, carried the stench of something older, an assumption as stale as his aftershave. Naomi's jaw tightened. She thought of her grandmother's warnings. "They'll try to move you. Naomi, even when you've earned the right to be there, they'll try to move you." From Seat 2B, a young woman looked up from a thick constitutional law textbook. Lena Torres, 27, had boarded minutes after Naomi and noticed her neighbor's quiet composure. She was no stranger to power dynamics or to watching injustice unfold in subtle tones. Something about the man's condescending pitch made her stomach clench. Without thinking, her hand slid into her tote and drew out her phone. The camera lens winked to life. Naomi noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye. A silent ally, or just a curious bystander ready to record another viral altercation. Her pulse ticked faster. She hated that this had become common, that dignity had to survive on the mercy of someone else's smartphone. Still, she said nothing. The man shifted closer, the sour tang of whiskey sweat hanging off him. "This woman," he announced loudly enough for row 3 to hear, clearly bought the wrong ticket. Maybe she thought her seat in the back entitled her to try her luck up here. The words landed with weight. Naomi inhaled, the smallest twitch of her jaw betraying the hit. She glanced at her planner, though her eyes no longer focused on its lines. Inside, a familiar inner battle raged. To stay quiet was to let him dig his own grave, to let his arrogance hang in the air for others to taste. But to stay quiet was also to risk becoming invisible, dismissed once again. If I rise now, will it be dignity or distraction? If I speak, will they hear me? Or will they only hear the caricature they expect me to be? She forced her breath steady. Lena's phone tilted, catching both faces in its frame. A few online viewers trickled in, commenting in disbelief. "Here we go again," one typed. The man, Richard Calloway, as the boarding pass declared, leaned back with smug certainty. "We all have places to be." He sneered. "Some of us important ones. Can we not waste everyone's time here?" Naomi's pen paused over the planner. She tapped it once, then twice. She was weighing her options, the way she would in any boardroom where the stakes felt unbearable, yet invisible to everyone else. Speak too soon, and you give the game away. Wait too long, and you risk being erased. She glanced briefly out the small oval window beside her. The tarmac glistened in the afternoon sun. Aircraft taxied. Ground crews moved like choreographed ants. And somewhere beneath the bustle lay a truth she couldn't ignore. She had fought her entire life to claim a seat like this. She would not surrender it so easily. And yet, the familiar ache pressed against her chest. Why must I always be the one proving I belong? Why must every seat, every table, every door be a battlefield? Her silence thickened, but not with passivity. It became presence, a canvas on which Richard painted his arrogance stroke by stroke. Around them, passengers sensed the storm gathering, Whispered commentary flowed like static. The cabin crew hadn't intervened yet, though Naomi could feel the weight of their glances. How long before one of them stepped in? And when they did, would they look to her as the mistake? She clicked her pen closed. The soft metallic snap echoed louder in her mind than Richard's ranting. Naomi Sinclair remained seated in 2A, and though she hadn't yet spoken, the story had already begun to write itself. The moment stretched, taut as a violin string. Richard Calloway stood planted in the aisle, his boarding pass flapping like a victory banner he had already claimed. His cheeks were blotched crimson, the veins along his temples rising like angry rivers. To him, this was not merely a dispute about a seat. It was theater, and he was determined to perform for every single person within earshot. Naomi Sinclair, however, refused to play her assigned role. She remained perfectly still, her legs crossed neatly. The planner balanced on her lap as though his presence barely warranted her attention. She felt the eyes of other passengers grazing her like 1,000 pinpricks, some sympathetic, some suspicious, all curious. Richard leaned in closer, his voice booming. "I paid a fortune for this ticket. Months ago, seat 2A, priority boarding, extra baggage, and now you're sitting here as if it's yours. What kind of scam is this?" Naomi inhaled slowly. Every fiber of her being wanted to meet his glare, to let her eyes slice through his entitlement like glass. But she reminded herself of her grandmother's wisdom. Don't give away your power to someone eager to consume it. She closed her planner instead, the soft thud deliberate, signaling that she was not invisible, she was simply unwilling to dignify him with a response. Richard mistook her silence for weakness. "You see this," he crowed, turning to the nearby passengers. "This is what I'm talking about. People sneaking where they don't belong, thinking they can just stroll into first class, plop down, and take what hard-working folks like me pay for? Unbelievable." Naomi's stomach tightened. The words were a blade sharpened not just against her, but against every echo of her life, every moment she'd been told she didn't belong in a room, every meeting where she was mistaken for the assistant instead of the decision-maker, every door that had been closed until she shoved it open. She thought of boardrooms where she was the only black woman in a sea of gray suits, of contracts nearly lost because clients assumed she couldn't possibly be the CEO. The temptation rose to speak, to cut him down with precision, to let her voice ring through the cabin with the authority she wielded in skyscrapers and investment halls. But she swallowed it down. Silence was sometimes more lethal than words. From 2B, Lena Torres shifted. She was a law student, but in this moment, she felt like a witness in a trial already in session. Her thumb hovered above the Go Live button on Instagram. She hesitated. Should she? Was it her place to expose this scene? Then she heard Richard again. "Look, sweetheart." He sneered toward Naomi, his voice dripping with condescension. "There's no shame in mixing up your ticket. It happens, but don't drag it out. Economy's back there. You'll be comfortable enough." The word "sweetheart" curdled in the air. Lena pressed the button. The red live icon blinked. Instantly, a handful of followers tuned in. Naomi's jaw clenched. Inside her mind, a debate raged. If she ignored him, would others assume guilt? If she responded, would she confirm their stereotype of the angry black woman? Why was she always balancing on this razor's edge? A sigh pressed against her ribs, but she would not let it out. She would not let him hear her exhale like surrender. "Sir, is everything all right?" A passing attendant paused, her voice clipped but polite. Her name tag read Megan Riley. Her eyes, almost reflexively, darted to Naomi first, not to the man towering over her. Naomi noticed, so did Lena's camera. Richard seized the moment. Finally, yes, there's a problem. This woman is in my seat. I need you to handle it. Megan's brow furrowed. May I see your boarding pass? Ma'am. Her tone wasn't hostile, but the weight of assumption was clear. Naomi reached calmly into her briefcase and produced her pass. The paper was crisp, embossed with the airline's gold executive circle stamp. She handed it over without a word. Megan studied it, her face betraying a flicker of uncertainty. This says 2A, she murmured. Of course it does, Richard barked, snatching at the air as though he could take it for himself. But so does mine. He thrust his crumpled pass at Megan with a flourish. See, seat 2A, paid in full, 6 months ago. Megan compared the two, her lips pressing into a line. It appears we may have a duplicate booking. It's rare, but it happens. Richard latched onto her words like a lifeline. Exactly. A glitch. And since I was standing here first, she needs to move. She was already seated when I boarded. Lena spoke up, her phone angled subtly, voice steady despite her racing heart. She's been here quietly for at least 20 minutes. Richard glared at her as though her words were a betrayal. Stay out of this, he snapped. This doesn't concern you. Lena didn't lower her phone. It concerns everyone when someone's dignity is being questioned without cause. Naomi glanced sideways, just for a second, at the young woman beside her. A silent gratitude flickered through her, though she remained outwardly composed. Inside, her heart pressed against its cage. She had allies now, but would it matter? The murmur of the cabin thickened. Passengers in row 3 craned their necks, their whispers rippling forward. Naomi could feel it, the collective anticipation of an audience watching, waiting, feeding off the conflict like moths to a flame. Richard puffed his chest, emboldened. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice loud enough to cut through the chatter. We are being delayed because someone doesn't know her place. The phrase hit Naomi's ears like a slap. She felt heat crawl up her neck, not from shame but from anger sharpened into diamond. Still, she did not rise. She reminded herself power is not about volume, it is about timing. Lena's livestream comment counter rolled upward 50 viewers, 100, 200, the chat filled with disbelief. Is this real? He's serious. Protect her, Naomi placed her hands on her lap, fingers interlaced, a gesture both serene and firm. She tilted her chin slightly, meeting Richard's glare for the first time. Her gaze was steady, clinical, as though she were studying an insect thrashing in a jar. She said nothing. The silence was devastating. Richard faltered, just for a breath, but his ego shoved him forward. Captain's going to hear about this. I have a critical meeting in Los Angeles. Millions of dollars on the line. I don't have time for confusion caused by someone sitting where she doesn't belong. The cabin door closed with a hollow thud. The announcement chimed overhead. Departure delayed 15 minutes. A collective groan rippled through the passengers. Richard grinned, misinterpreting the captain's words as a proof of his righteousness. Naomi's phone vibrated gently in her purse. A notification preview flickered, confidential Horizon Tech acquisition proposal. She swiped it away with calm precision, though not before Lena's camera caught the embossed subject line. The live stream chat exploded. Wait, did anyone else see that she's someone important? But Naomi kept her focus forward. Her eyes calm seas concealing storm tides. Inside, the war raged. Should she reveal herself now, end the charade with one sweep of truth? Or should she wait, let him climb higher on his own arrogance until the fall was undeniable? She pressed her palms together softly, whispering inwardly a mantra she had carried since her first hostile boardroom at 25. Hold steady. Let them show who they are. Richard was obliging. He was showing everything. And the cabin, the crew, and now the world watching through Lena's phone were seeing it too. The tension inside the cabin had become a living thing, a presence that hung heavy in the recycled air. Naomi Sinclair could feel it wrapping around her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. Every passenger nearby had stopped pretending to mind their own business. Conversations stilled, earbuds slipped out, and even the hum of laptop keyboards had faded. All attention was funneled into the narrow aisle of row 2, where Richard Calloway continued to hold court as if the plane were his personal stage. A stewardess appeared, brisk and efficient, her navy uniform pressed with the kind of precision only decades of habit could produce. Megan Riley, 20 years with the airline, a face weathered not by age but by exposure to thousands of similar confrontations. Her professional smile was firm but practiced, and her eyes moved with muscle memory straight to Naomi. "Is there a problem here?" Megan asked, but her body language betrayed where she had already placed the weight of suspicion. Her shoulders angled toward Naomi, her eyebrows lifted in mild reprimand. Richard, catching the cue, straightened with satisfaction. "Yes, there's a problem," he announced loudly enough for row 4 to hear. "This woman is in my seat. 2A. Been mine since the day I bought it." Megan nodded slightly, turning back toward Naomi as though she were the accused in a small courtroom. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" The request was not unreasonable, but Naomi felt the sting of its direction. She had been sitting quietly, ticket in hand, long before Richard had arrived. Yet here she was, forced to validate herself under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes. Her grandmother's words echoed again. "They will ask you for proof even after you've already paid." With a steady movement, Naomi opened her briefcase and retrieved the pristine pass. Its paper was thick, embossed with gold lettering at the top. She extended it without a word. Megan glanced down, her brow furrowing. "This shows seat 2A, executive circle." Naomi remained silent, her face composed, but a spark of indignation smoldered beneath her calm. Richard shoved forward his crumpled slip of paper, snatching Megan's attention. "And this says the same thing, 2A, booked 6 months ago. I shouldn't have to stand here arguing while my seat is being stolen." Megan compared the two documents, her frown deepening. "It appears we may have a duplicate booking. Rare, but not impossible." The phrase duplicate booking trickled into the cabin like a weak excuse. Richard latched onto it. "There you go. Simple. She moves. Problem solved." Naomi's pulse quickened. Again, she felt that familiar edge, the place where patience and dignity battled for dominance. Should she speak now? Should she force them to acknowledge the absurdity of punishing the person who had done nothing wrong before she could decide? Lena Torres spoke from her seat beside Naomi. Her phone, still broadcasting, was angled upward, capturing the scene. "For the record, she was seated here when I boarded. She hasn't moved since. She's been reading quietly, bothering no one. He's the one making a scene." Richard whipped his head toward her, his voice sharp. "Mind your business, young lady." Lena didn't flinch. Her heart hammered, but law school had trained her voice to hold steady under pressure. "It became my business the moment you raised your voice and started accusing her without cause." The live stream comment counter ticked higher. 400, 500. Messages scrolled across Lena's screen. "Stay strong. Document everything. We're watching." Naomi noticed. For the first time, she felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, but recognition. Someone else was shouldering part of the weight. Megan exhaled sharply. "I understand your frustration, sir," she said, addressing Richard now. "But let's stay calm. We'll sort this out." Her attempt at neutrality was too thin. Naomi caught the subtle tilt of her body, the way her tone softened for Richard but hardened for her. Bias wasn't always a hammer. Sometimes it was a whisper, a nudge, a glance. Richard seized the moment, his voice booming once more. "Captain should be notified. I have an important meeting in Los Angeles. This delay is costing me money." At the mention of the captain, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned for a better view. Some shook their heads at Richard's arrogance. Others exchanged knowing looks that betrayed their alignment with him. Naomi could read their faces. She had seen them in boardrooms, in country clubs, in hotel lobbies, people who would side with volume and bluster over quiet composure. Every time. Her fingers tightened on her planner. Inside her, two voices warred. One whispered, "Keep still. Let them expose themselves." The other screamed, "Enough. Speak. Defend yourself." Her throat ached with the weight of unsaid words. Megan tried again, her patience thinning. "Ma'am," she said to Naomi, "perhaps you'd be willing to move to another seat in first class while we sort this out." Gasps scattered across the cabin. The request was polite, but the implication was not. Naomi's chest constricted. Her silence had been tactical, but now it threatened to erase her completely. Move, yield, allow him to dictate her worth. Her mind flashed through memories like lightning strikes. A conference where she was mistaken for the assistant. A meeting where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by a man. The time she was told she must have charmed her way into the contract. Always, always, the expectation that she would step aside gracefully. No, not this time. She straightened slightly, her gaze locking onto Megan's. Her voice remained unspoken, but her posture delivered the message, "I will not move." Richard's grin widened, mistaking the pause for victory. "See, she knows she doesn't belong. Captain's gonna have to handle this." Naomi's jaw tightened. Inside, a storm churned. She thought of the delicate balance she had always maintained: dignity without anger, resolve without aggression. Could she hold it now? Under this suffocating scrutiny, the overhead screen flickered. Departure delayed 15 minutes. Richard puffed with self-importance, gesturing grandly to the cabin. "You see, everyone's inconvenienced because of this mix-up, because she won't move." Naomi felt the sting like salt on a wound. It was always her refusal to disappear that was cast as disruption. Her breath caught, her lungs resisting the recycled air. From the corner of her eye, she saw Lena's phone. The viewer count had doubled again. 800, 900. A tide of witnesses Naomi had never asked for, never wanted, but perhaps desperately needed. Her hands rested still on her lap, but inside, her resolve hardened. She would not be moved, not by Richard's volume, not by Megan's assumption, not even by her own fear of fitting into the stereotype they were eager to cast her in. The cabin had become a stage, and whether she wanted it or not, Naomi Sinclair was the central character. She would choose how this act unfolded. The minutes ticked by with the weight of hours. The boarding door was sealed now, yet the plane remained tethered to the gate, the cabin pulsing with impatience. Naomi Sinclair felt every eye drilling into her back. She could hear the scratch of pens on crossword puzzles abandoned, the shuffle of shoes as passengers leaned into the aisle to watch the drama play out. The air had thickened with anticipation, each breath a little harder to draw. Richard Calloway thrived in it. He puffed his chest like a prizefighter, voice rising with every word. "This is ridiculous. I don't care what kind of mix-up your system caused. I paid for 2A, and I won't stand for being treated like this. Some of us have real business to attend to in Los Angeles." Naomi sat motionless, but inside her chest a storm brewed. She thought of her mourning, the careful ritual she had clung to the perfectly folded scarf, the quiet meditation before leaving her penthouse, the deliberate way she packed her briefcase with the proposal documents. Everything had been designed for control. Yet here she was, her composure tested again by the oldest of assaults disbelief in her right to exist where she sat. The murmurs reached the cockpit, and at last the cabin door opened. A tall figure emerged, his Navy uniform trimmed with gold, Captain Howard Grant. His face bore the weary lines of decades of long-haul flights, his shoulders carrying the weight of responsibility for 200 lives. But at this moment, his expression was more irritation than authority. Delays meant paperwork. Delays meant schedules unraveling like loose threads. "What's the problem here?" His voice was deep, gravelly, and carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The murmurs died instantly. Megan Riley turned, relief flashing in her eyes. "Captain, we have a duplicate booking for seat 2A. Both passengers have boarding passes for the same seat." Captain Grant's eyes flicked between Naomi and Richard, one calm, elegant, and silent, the other red-faced, loud, jabbing his finger toward the seat. The scales of his unconscious judgment tilted swiftly, almost invisibly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm, almost curt, "I'm going to need you to either move to another seat or step off the aircraft so we can resolve this at the gate." The words struck Naomi like cold water. Her spine stiffened, but she didn't speak. She had anticipated it. Hadn't she? She had known where the balance of doubt would fall. Still, the sting was sharp. Richard grinned, a grotesque curve of triumph. "Thank you, Captain." Finally, someone with sense. Lena Torres gasped softly beside Naomi, her phone still recording. She turned the camera squarely toward the captain. Her voice, usually careful, rang with outrage. "Are you serious? You're telling the woman who's been sitting here quietly all along to get off the plane. She hasn't raised her voice once. He's the one yelling. How is this justice?" The live stream chat erupted. Comments cascaded across the screen. "Classic discrimination. We see what's happening. Don't let them push her out." The captain's jaw tautened. He didn't look at Lena. His gaze remained locked on Naomi. "Ma'am, this flight can't depart until this is resolved. We're already behind schedule. Please cooperate." Naomi rose slowly, the movement deliberate. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Every eye followed her as she reached for her briefcase in the overhead bin. Her silence was not submission, It was suspense. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. Richard leaned back with smug satisfaction, whispering just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That's right. About time." Naomi heard him. She always heard. The words carved into her like old scars reopening. The phrase about time carrying with it decades of assumption that she did not belong, that her presence was provisional, conditional. Her hand rested on the handle of the briefcase. Fingers pressing against the cool leather. Inside, the documents that could change everything waited like a sword in its sheath. But should she draw it now? The question thundered in her chest. If she revealed who she was, she would silence them all in a single stroke. Yet doing so would mean surrendering her privacy, her shield of anonymity. She had boarded this flight not as the CEO of Sinclair Global, but as a woman seeking a few hours of quiet between battles. Was it fair that she had to wield her identity as a weapon just to sit in peace? Her thoughts tangled. She remembered another time, years ago, when she had been humiliated at a gala, mistaken for staff by a board member she would later outvote. She had remained silent then, letting the moment pass, but the sting had lingered. Silence had not protected her dignity. It had only protected his ignorance. She exhaled slowly. Perhaps today, silence would not be enough. "Captain, we can't wait much longer," Megan said softly. Her eyes flicked to Naomi again, pleading now, pleading for compliance, not justice. Before Naomi could speak, another figure entered the cabin from the jet bridge. Dana Cooper, the flight supervisor, clipboard in hand, her walk brisk, her expression impatient. 20 years in service had given her the look of someone who had handled everything from crying infants to mid-air medical emergencies. Yet, as she approached, even she slowed, sensing the gravity in the air. "What's the delay?" Dana asked. "Seat in dispute," Captain Grant replied tersely. "Duplicate booking. Passenger refuses to move." His gesture was toward Naomi, not Richard. Dana's eyes widened slightly, taking in the scene. Her gaze darted to the phones raised in nearly every row now, the glow of screens capturing every word, every glance. The tension was no longer confined to the cabin. It was broadcasting outward, multiplied and magnified in real time. Naomi stood poised, briefcase in hand, her silence vibrating like a struck chord. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her face remained serene. She knew the next word she spoke or didn't would ripple far beyond this cabin. Lena whispered toward her phone, the urgency in her voice rising. "They're about to kick her off. You all are seeing this live. This is happening right now." The viewer count ticked past 1,000. Richard turned, emboldened by the captain's stance. "Finally, we're getting somewhere. She had no right to sit here in the first place. I have a meeting worth millions. I can't afford to waste time on this nonsense." Naomi's silence deepened. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the window, to the tarmac glowing under late afternoon sunlight. In her chest, a voice rose steady and clear. "Not today. Not again." She turned back toward the crew, her hand tightening on the briefcase. She was ready now, ready to show them who they were dealing with. And when she did, there would be no going back. The air inside the cabin felt brittle, as though one wrong word might shatter it completely. Naomi Sinclair stood with her briefcase in hand, the captain's order hanging in the air like a verdict. Every pair of eyes waited for her decision. Would she leave quietly, validating every prejudice, Or would she resist and risk escalation? Richard Calloway leaned back against the aisle, smugness radiating from every pore. He was already rehearsing the victory story he would tell later, how he defended his seat, how he exposed someone trying to take advantage of the system. His grin widened, but then it faltered when he saw Naomi click open the locks of her briefcase. The metallic snap echoed through the cabin, a sound small yet seismic. Passengers shifted, leaning forward, phones tilted higher, capturing the moment. Lena Torres, her live-stream chat exploding with comments, whispered into her mic, "Something's happening. She's about to show them." Naomi's hand reached inside. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, steady but strong. This was not how she had planned to travel today. She had intended to remain invisible, to work quietly on the documents inside, yet invisibility was no longer an option. She withdrew a single sheet of paper, crisp and official, its letterhead heavy with corporate authority. She extended it toward Captain Howard Grant. Her voice, calm and resonant, sliced through the silence. "Before you make a career-ending mistake. Captain, I believe you should see this." The captain's eyes narrowed as he took the page. He expected an appeal letter, a printout of a boarding pass, perhaps even a desperate plea. Instead, as his gaze swept the text, his expression transformed. Confusion first, then recognition, and finally, something approaching dread. The color drained from his face. He looked up at Naomi with new eyes, as though he were seeing her for the very first time. His jaw tightened, but not with authority this time, with fear. Richard, impatient, leaned closer. "Well, what is it, some fake idea sob story? Let's not waste more time." But Captain Grant didn't answer him. His eyes remained locked on Naomi, his hand trembling slightly as he returned the paper. "Dr. Sinclair," he said, his voice now subdued, "I had no idea." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Megan Riley stepped closer, peering at the document, and her lips parted in shock. Dana Cooper, the flight supervisor, leaned over the captain's shoulder, her face blanching as she caught the name on the letterhead. Lena's phone shook in her grip. She whispered, half to herself, half to her viewers, "Oh my God, did he just call her Dr. Sinclair? Wait, I think she's someone powerful." The live stream comments erupted. "Who is she?" Look at the captain's face. "This is huge." Naomi reclaimed the paper with quiet precision and slid it back into her briefcase. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she sat back down in 2A, crossing her legs gracefully, and reopened her planner. Only then did she speak. "Just my credentials," she said softly. Richard blinked, confusion knitting his brows. "Credentials? What are you talking about? What does a boarding pass have to do with credentials?" Naomi turned a page, her pen poised once again. She didn't look at him, but her words carried across the aisle. "Richard Calloway. Is it, you may want to lower your voice before you say anything else you'll regret." The warning was not shouted. It was not even sharp, but it landed with devastating clarity. Richard's mouth opened, then closed again, his certainty beginning to crumble. The cabin had shifted. The energy that moments ago seemed stacked against Naomi now hovered on a knife's edge. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity mounting. The story unfolding before them had taken a dramatic turn, and they could sense the weight of revelation approaching. Dana Cooper stepped closer, lowering her voice, though microphones still captured every syllable. "Dr. Sinclair, forgive us. We didn't recognize you." Naomi finally looked up, her eyes calm but unwavering. "That's precisely the point, isn't it?" Richard frowned, his confusion giving way to frustration. "Recognize her. Recognize her as who she's just, some woman who took my seat. I don't care if she's got a fancy title at some company." Lena's live stream viewers were less ignorant. Their comments blazed across the screen. Naomi Sinclair. The Naomi Sinclair. She runs Sinclair Global. She's on the Forbes list. Lena's eyes widened as she read them aloud, her voice shaky with excitement. "Guys, they're saying she's the CEO of Sinclair Global, billionaire, controlling stake in multiple industries. This isn't just any passenger." The realization detonated through the cabin like an explosion. Passengers sat up straighter, whispers turned to audible gasps, and suddenly the narrative shifted. Naomi closed her planner gently. She let her gaze travel across the stunned faces of the crew, pausing briefly on Captain Grant. "You were about to have me removed from this plane, not because I caused a disruption, not because I raised my voice, but because my presence here didn't fit your expectation of who belongs in 2A. Megan Riley's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "Dr. Sinclair, Naomi held up a hand. "No apologies. Not yet. Actions first. Words later." Richard's face had gone pale. He stammered, voice suddenly stripped of its earlier bravado. "You can't be serious. This is some kind of act. You can't be who they say." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharpening. "Mr. Calloway, I own a controlling stake in this airline. That means every member of this crew ultimately answers to me, including you, Captain." The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. The cabin erupted in gasps. Captain Grant stood frozen, his authority stripped bare. Megan clutched her notepad like a lifeline. Dana's clipboard trembled in her hands, and Richard Calloway, once bloated with entitlement, now sat deflated, his arrogance punctured by the reality of who he had confronted. Naomi leaned back, her poise unshaken. "So, I'll ask one more time. Who exactly is in the wrong seat?" Here, silence blanketed the cabin. Even the engines outside seemed to hum more softly, as though the plane itself had paused to witness the moment. Naomi Sinclair had revealed her power, and the storm was only just beginning. The cabin had slipped into a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the hush after a thunderclap. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the low drone of the air conditioning and the faint buzz of Lena Torres's phone, its live stream capturing every stunned face in first class. Naomi Sinclair sat composed in seat 2A, her briefcase back at her side, her planner neatly closed. The power balance in the room had shifted entirely, though her voice had not once risen above calm clarity. "Let us review what just happened," Naomi said, her tone smooth, deliberate, and cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I was seated in my assigned place, quietly, reading. A man arrives late, belligerent, and accuses me of theft. A crew member defaults to his side without question. A captain, upon seeing a calm black woman and an agitated white man, decides the woman must be the problem. And I, the one harassed, am nearly removed from an aircraft I partly own." She let the words hang, each syllable weighted with undeniable truth. Megan Riley's cheeks burned crimson. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but every possible word turned to ash in her mouth. Captain Howard Grant shifted uncomfortably, his authority dissolving under Naomi's steady gaze. For decades, he had been accustomed to being the final voice in any dispute. Now, his own words replayed in his mind like a damning echo. "I need you to either move or step off the aircraft." Dana Cooper, the flight supervisor, looked between them all. Her clipboard clutched so tightly her knuckles blanched. She could already sense the magnitude of this moment. Phones were raised in half the rows of first class. Lena's live stream count ticked past 3,000 viewers. Richard Calloway, red-faced and sputtering, tried to reassert control. "This is absurd. I didn't know who you were." If I had known, Naomi's eyebrow arched slightly. "If you had known, you would have treated me with respect. Is that what you're admitting?" Her question struck like a whip. Richard froze, mouth opening, then closing again. His eyes darted to the rows of passengers staring at him, to the phones recording his every twitch, to Lena's camera that never wavered. He realized, too late, that there was no answer he could give that would save him. Naomi continued, her tone sharper now, though still composed. "You attempted to intimidate me. You raised your voice. You made assumptions about where I belong. You disrupted an entire flight. And you did all this because you could not imagine that a black woman might rightfully hold a seat of power both in this cabin and beyond." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded slowly, shame creeping across their features. Others avoided eye contact, confronted by their own silent complicity. Richard swallowed hard, sweat dampening his collar. I didn't mean it like that." Naomi's gaze held him, cool and unflinching. "Intent is irrelevant. Impact is what matters. And the impact of your actions is here, for all to see." She gestured toward Lena's phone, its red light glowing like a witness's seal. The chat feed scrolled so quickly Lena could barely keep up. This is history. She's destroying him with pure composure. The world needs to see this. Naomi shifted her focus to the crew. Captain Grant, Ms. Riley, Supervisor Cooper. "Do you realize what you almost did? You nearly humiliated not just a paying passenger, but your own employer. You were seconds away from forcing me off this plane, not because of evidence, not because of disruption, but because of bias. A bias so ingrained you didn't even recognize it." The captain's lips parted, but no words came. He could only nod faintly, the weight of her words pressing into him like gravity. Megan's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly, whispering, I didn't think. I just reacted." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but not cruel. "That is precisely the problem. You didn't think. And when people in positions of responsibility stop thinking, when they operate on assumptions, injustice thrives." Dana Cooper cleared her throat, her voice trembling. "Dr. Sinclair, you're right. We failed you, and everyone here saw it." Naomi regarded her for a long moment, then nodded once. Acknowledgement is the first step, but accountability must follow. The cabin seemed to pulse with electricity. Passengers were riveted. Even those who had muttered in agreement with Richard earlier now shrank back, unwilling to be associated with him. Richard, desperate, leaned forward. "Look, I'm sorry. I said things I shouldn't have. I let my temper get the better of me. Please, let's just move on." Naomi turned her eyes back to him, her expression unreadable. "You want to move on because you fear the consequences, but moving on without consequence is how this behavior repeats, generation after generation. What lesson would be learned then?" Richard's shoulders slumped. For the first time, He seemed smaller, diminished not just in posture but in spirit. Naomi inhaled deeply, centering herself. Her internal voice whispered the truth she had always known: this was bigger than her. This was about every woman who had been told she didn't belong, every passenger who had been dismissed, every silent humiliation unrecorded because no one like Lena had held up a camera. She turned to Lena. "Miss Torres." Lena startled, the phone nearly slipping in her hand. "Yes." Ma'am. Naomi's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Thank you for not looking away, for understanding that silence protects the oppressor, not the oppressed. You did what many would not." Lena's throat tightened. She blinked back tears, her viewers surging past 5,000 now. She managed a nod, her voice a whisper. "I just thought it was the right thing." Naomi faced the cabin once more, and that is what we all must strive to do. The right thing, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it goes against the grain of habit or assumption. Especially then. The cabin erupted in quiet applause. It was hesitant at first, then grew stronger, the sound echoing in the confined space. Richard shrank deeper into his seat. His earlier bravado dissolved completely. Naomi raised a hand gently, and the applause subsided. Her eyes swept across the crew. "We are not finished. There will be discussions, investigations, changes. But for now, we have a flight to take, and I, for one, am ready to depart." She opened her planner once more, the motion calm, deliberate, final. The message was clear: she was in her seat, and she was not moving. Lena ended her live stream, but not before announcing to her thousands of viewers, "Remember this moment." Because we just witnessed power, dignity, and justice at 30,000 feet. The plane had not yet left the ground, but already history was in motion. The air inside the cabin had shifted. What once crackled with tension now vibrated with something else, an uneasy awareness, the kind that makes people sit a little straighter, as if recognizing they've just witnessed history. Naomi Sinclair let the silence linger, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. She could see the discomfort in some faces, the dawning recognition in others. Phones were still raised, though fewer now dared to whisper commentary. Everyone was waiting, caught between the fear of what might come next and the thrill of being part of something extraordinary. Naomi leaned back in her seat, but her eyes remained locked on the passengers. "I need you all to understand something," she began, her voice low yet carrying to the back of first class. "This isn't just about a seat. It's about what this seat represents, who is assumed to belong here, and who is assumed not to. That is the heart of this confrontation." A ripple of uneasy shifting spread through the rows. Naomi pressed on. "For some of you, this may be the first time you've seen such a confrontation unfold in public, but I assure you, it is not the first time it has happened. It happens quietly, every day, to people who do not have the means, the platform, or the witnesses to resist it." Richard Calloway squirmed in his seat, his earlier bravado shriveled to silence. Megan Riley dabbed at her eyes with the corner of a napkin, her professional mask shattered. Captain Grant's posture slumped, a man forced to confront the cracks in his authority. Naomi let her gaze sweep over them before settling on Lena Torres. "Miss Torres, your decision to record this wasn't just about me. It was about accountability. You created a record that no one here can deny. That is the power of bearing witness." Lena's throat tightened, but she managed to nod. "I just couldn't let it go unseen." Naomi smiled faintly, and because of that, thousands are already watching. By the time we land, it will be millions. What happened here will not disappear. It will be discussed, dissected, and remembered. And that is good. Discomfort is the first step toward change. The chat feed on Lena's phone had been climbing so fast she could barely read it. Influencers were already reposting. News outlets clipping sections, hashtags multiplying. Seat 2A was trending, as was Yas Naomi Sinclair. One comment caught her eye. The FAA needs to see this. She read it aloud, and murmurs of agreement spread. Naomi caught the phrase and nodded. Yes, the Federal Aviation Administration will see this, and so will the Department of Transportation, because what just unfolded here is not a minor inconvenience. It is a systemic failure, a failure of training, a failure of accountability, and a failure of imagination. She paused, her eyes finding Captain Grant's. When, faced with conflict, you imagined only one possibility, that the woman who looked out of place must be in the wrong. That assumption nearly cost you your career, and it will cost this airline more than you realize. The captain swallowed hard. Dr. Sinclair. Naomi raised a hand, silencing him gently but firmly. Do not apologize to me. Captain, apologies are easy. Action is harder, and action is what will be required. Dana Cooper, still clutching her clipboard, spoke for the first time in a steady voice. What action do you want us to take? Dr. Sinclair. Naomi studied her for a long moment. That depends. Do you want to patch a crack in the wall, or do you want to rebuild the foundation? Because what I expect is not a token gesture. I expect change that reaches every gate agent, every crew member, every cockpit. Change that ensures what happened here never happens again. The murmurs grew louder. Passengers who had initially sided with Richard now looked down at their shoes, chastened. A man in 3C who had muttered about rules not applying earlier shifted uncomfortably, his phone slipping from his hand. Even those in economy, leaning over from the curtain, could sense the tide turning. Richard finally found his voice, brittle and weak. Look, I admit I made a mistake. I shouldn't have spoken the way I did. I'll post an apology, a public one. Just, please, don't destroy my reputation over this. Naomi's gaze settled on him, cool and unwavering. Mr. Calloway, you must understand this is not about your reputation. This is about accountability. You tried to strip me of my dignity because you assumed I did not belong. Now the world will decide whether you belong among them. The words sliced cleanly, and Richard had no response. He shrank back, the sweat on his forehead glistening under the cabin lights. Naomi turned back to the passengers. Many of you stayed silent during this. Some of you even nodded in agreement when Mr. Calloway declared his entitlement. I do not fault you for your fear or hesitation, but I ask you, what will you do next time? Will you sit quietly while someone else is humiliated, or will you intervene, even in small ways, to stand on the side of dignity? The question pierced the cabin like a challenge. No one answered aloud, but the weight of reflection was visible in their expressions. Lena's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, eyes widening. Dr. Sinclair, it's already hit the news. CNN, MSNBC, BBC, they're calling it the woman in 2A. Naomi exhaled slowly. She had known this would go far, but the speed startled even her. Still, she kept her composure. Good. Let it be seen. Let the world wrestle with what it reveals. At that moment, Dana Cooper's own phone vibrated. She glanced at it, her eyes widening. "Captain, Dr. Sinclair, the FAA's Office of Civil Rights just emailed us. They've been monitoring social media. They want a full report on this incident when we land." Gasps rippled through the cabin again. Captain Grant looked stricken, his career flashing before his eyes. Naomi's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Then, let's give them a report worth reading." She folded her hands in her lap, her voice softening but still carrying its weight. "Remember, this power does not only lie in titles or wealth. Power lies in how we treat each other when no one is watching. Today, you were all witnesses. Now you must decide whether you will also be participants in change." Her words lingered in the recycled air, seeping into the minds of every listener. The engines outside roared to life, the plane preparing at last to push back. But no one in that cabin would ever think of Seat 2A the same way again. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft finally began to push back from the gate. Yet, inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere felt less like the start of a journey and more like the opening of a tribunal. Naomi Sinclair had transformed her seat into a stage, her words into verdicts, and the passengers into reluctant jurors. Dana Cooper's phone still glowed with the email notification from the FAA. The weight of that message hung heavy. Megan Riley sat stiffly, her hands folded, eyes downcast. Captain Grant had returned to the cockpit, but not before casting one last anxious look toward Naomi, a silent acknowledgement that his authority now lived on borrowed time. Naomi reached into her briefcase once more. This time, instead of a single sheet, she pulled out a slim leather portfolio. She opened it with the same care a surgeon might use to expose a patient's beating heart. Inside were documents, financial reports, organizational charts, notes in her elegant handwriting. She set the folder on the small pull-out table in front of her, then looked around the cabin. "We are in motion," she said calmly. "And since we have time before cruising altitude, we may as well put it to use. Consider this an impromptu meeting, a very public one." Passengers exchanged nervous glances. The man in 3C, who earlier had muttered that Naomi didn't belong, now avoided her eyes altogether. Lena Torres, her phone, live again, whispered into the mic. "She's about to turn this into a boardroom at 30,000 feet. Naomi's gaze shifted to Dana and Megan, both standing just a few feet away. "Supervisor Cooper, Ms. Riley, let's begin with facts. Do you know the average cost of a federal discrimination lawsuit against a major airline?" Dana blinked, unsure whether to answer. I don't have that number." "I do," Naomi said smoothly. $4 million, on average, when it settles quietly. When it goes to trial, tens of millions. And that doesn't include reputational damage." She tapped the folder lightly. "In the past 2 hours, this airline has already lost nearly 9% of its market value in after-hours trading. That's over $6 billion in shareholder equity evaporated because of what unfolded in this cabin." Gasps rippled across the rows. Even the passengers who had been silent could not ignore the enormity of those numbers. Naomi leaned back, her composure unwavering. "So you see, this is not a personal matter. This is a systemic failure that has tangible consequences." Megan's lips trembled as she whispered, What do you want us to do?" "Dr. Sinclair," Naomi's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "I want change. Real change. Effective immediately. And I will not wait for headquarters to draft talking points. It starts here, now, on this plane. Dana clutched her clipboard tighter. What? What kind of change? Naomi's voice sharpened with precision. First, I want zero-tolerance discrimination protocols drafted within 72 hours. Every employee, from baggage handlers to the board of directors, will undergo comprehensive unconscious bias and de-escalation training. Second, there will be an independent ethics and compliance department reporting directly to me. No more complaints buried under layers of bureaucracy. Third, I want a passenger advocacy hotline and mobile app operational within 60 days, allowing customers to report harassment directly, without fear of being silenced. She paused, letting the weight of her demands sink in. Passengers shifted, murmuring, as if they too were being drafted into the moment. Lena's phone buzzed with a flood of comments. She's running the airline from the cabin. This is unreal. History in real time. Naomi wasn't finished. Fourth, I expect quarterly diversity audits made public. Transparency is not negotiable. Fifth, hiring practices will prioritize diversity and emotional intelligence, and leadership positions will no longer be a homogeneous reflection of outdated power structures. Dana swallowed, nodding furiously as if already taking mental notes. Megan wiped her eyes, whispering, "Yes, ma'am, whatever it takes." Naomi looked at her directly. "Ms. Riley, you defaulted to believe in Mr. Calloway over me without a shred of evidence. You did not pause to question your assumption. That is what systemic bias looks like. I don't say this to humiliate you. I say this because if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere in your career. And if it happens again, the consequences will not just be personal embarrassment, they will be catastrophic for you, for your colleagues, and for this airline." Megan nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand. I truly do." Richard, silent until now, finally raised his voice. "This is insane. You can't just dictate policy in the middle of a flight." Naomi turned her eyes on him, calm but devastating. "Mr. Calloway, I can. Because when you hold 71% of controlling shares, you do not make requests. You issue directives. And right now, you are very fortunate that my directive is not to have you removed mid-air." Richard's face drained of color. He slumped back in his seat, defeated, every ounce of bluster gone. Naomi's attention returned to the passengers. "All of you are witnesses to this. And because of that, you are part of the solution. When this video circulates, and it already has, you will have a choice. You can remain passive observers, or you can speak out, support reform, and ensure that incidents like this are not forgotten. I expect you to choose wisely." The cabin grew still again. Then, from somewhere in the back, a smattering of applause began. It grew slowly, hesitantly, until it filled the entire section. Naomi raised a hand, silencing it with gentle authority. "This is not about applause. This is about accountability. Change will come, not because you clapped for it, but because you demanded it." She closed her folder, slid it back into her briefcase, and leaned back in her seat with the same calm she had begun the journey with. Her voice, though quieter now, still carried. "We will land in Los Angeles in 5 hours. By the time we do, the world will already have its story. The question is, will that story end here, as a spectacle, or will it begin here, as a movement?" Lena's live stream ticked past 25,000 viewers. The comments were no longer just shock and outrage. They were calls to action. Lawyers offering pro bono services, activists connecting the dots to other industries, politicians tagging themselves into the thread. The world was listening. And in seat 2A, Naomi Sinclair knew she had just turned a moment of humiliation into a blueprint for revolution. The applause subsided as if the cabin itself were holding its breath. Naomi Sinclair allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible exhale, though inside, her mind raced with the weight of responsibility. This was no longer about a single seat or a moment of injustice. It was about a system that had failed repeatedly, and about her ability to correct it in real time while hundreds of people watched, physically trapped in the sky and emotionally tethered to every word she said. Dana Cooper glanced at Naomi, her posture stiff, as if the weight of her own mistakes pressed down on her shoulders. She had thought she understood her job, the rules, the procedures, but Naomi's calm authority made her feel like she had been blind to the consequences of unquestioned assumptions. Dana's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the tablet that had tracked passenger complaints for years. Suddenly, each overlooked incident, every email dismissed without proper attention, flashed before her eyes. How many times had she allowed bias to dictate her judgment? Megan Riley sat in silence, her thoughts chaotic. She felt the sting of public exposure, the humiliation of having her bias laid bare. Yet a strange clarity emerged from Naomi's presence. This woman, unflinching in the face of hostility, was not attacking her as a person. She was demanding accountability, forcing her to confront the ways she had failed others, and in doing so, was giving her a chance to grow. Megan's chest tightened, and she whispered to herself, "I don't want to be that person again." Richard Calloway, still slumped in 4A, scowled. His entitlement had been a shield for years, allowing him to manipulate, demand, and assume superiority. But here, at 35,000 feet, none of that worked. Naomi's authority was absolute, not because of her position alone, but because of the integrity behind her actions. Richard's internal monologue was a swirl of panic and anger. He wanted to assert control, to belittle Naomi as he always had others. But every glance from her reminded him that the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. He was powerless in a cabin that had become a courtroom, a boardroom, and a public stage all at once. Naomi's eyes swept the cabin again, lingering on passengers who were not merely observers but participants in the moral reckoning unfolding in front of them. She could see the fear, the curiosity, and the growing sense of responsibility in their faces. For some, this was history being made; for others, a chance to examine their own prejudices. Her pulse remained steady, though inside, she wrestled with a complex mixture of anger, grief, and determination. The injustice they had all witnessed could have been ignored, swept under the rug as so many incidents were, but she refused to let that happen. The flight attendants, now silent, shifted uneasily. Clara Jensen, the chief attendant, felt the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. She had been complicit, if only through inaction, and Naomi's presence made it impossible to maintain the facade of indifference. Each decision, each choice felt magnified under Naomi's scrutiny. Clara's inner voice screamed that she should resist, defend herself. Yet she knew any attempt at argument would crumble under Naomi's composed authority. Naomi opened her laptop, placing it on the pull-out table, and tapped a series of commands that connected her to the airline's internal systems. Passengers could see the glow of the screen, the spreadsheets, the email chains, the live feed of internal communications. It was an unspoken demonstration control without chaos. She was showing them that accountability could be transparent, structured, and immediate. Dana's lips parted as she tried to interject, to explain herself. Dr. Sinclair, I didn't realize. Naomi held up a hand, gentle but firm. Dana, you did not act out of malice. You acted out of habit, conditioned by a system that rewards conformity and punishes questioning. That is why systemic change is necessary, and that is why it starts with us right now, in this cabin, in front of witnesses who will carry this lesson beyond these walls, or, in this case, beyond this fuselage. Megan swallowed hard, and the passengers she asked, they just watched. Some cheered, some were angry. Naomi nodded. That is the reality of power. People will react differently when confronted with truth. Some embrace it, some resist it. Our job, as leaders and witnesses, is to ensure that the truth is not diluted, that it is not diminished by discomfort, that it becomes the catalyst for action rather than a fleeting spectacle. A young woman in 2D raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why are you doing this here, on the plane? Couldn't you wait until the flight lands? Naomi's gaze softened as she met the young woman's eyes. Because injustice does not wait for convenience. Because the moment for accountability is always now, no matter where you are, and because the higher the stakes, the more people pay attention, the more likely change becomes unavoidable. Richard scoffed audibly, but Naomi didn't flinch. She turned her attention to him with a calm decisiveness that made his words evaporate before they even reached the cabin air. Mr. Calloway, your disbelief is understandable. You have spent your life insulated by wealth, status, and the assumption that rules apply to everyone except you. Today, you are learning that accountability is not negotiable, and the world is watching. Naomi felt a pang of fatigue, a rare moment when the adrenaline driving her resolve met the human need for pause. She allowed herself a deep inhale, the cabin lights dimming slightly as the captain adjusted for cruising altitude. Even in this pause, tension lingered, thick and palpable. She thought about the countless people who had suffered quietly under bias, under dismissal, under the arrogance of those who assumed superiority. The weight of responsibility pressed on her chest, but she did not flinch. The passengers shifted in their seats, the murmurs growing as whispers spread. Phones were lifted, messages typed, cameras pointed. Naomi knew that by the time the plane touched down, the story would have traveled far beyond this cabin. Yet she remained grounded, focusing on the immediate ensuring that every word, every directive, every glance was precise, intentional. Megan glanced at Dana and then at Naomi. I don't know how we got here, she whispered, almost to herself, but I feel like I have to. Change, truly change. Naomi allowed herself the faintest of nods, and that is exactly why we cannot let this moment pass unnoticed. Change begins with recognition, with acceptance, with the courage to act when others hesitate. If we fail to do that, then every passenger, every employee, every bystander will carry the burden of another missed opportunity. The hum of the engines rose as the plane leveled out. Naomi's eyes swept once more across the cabin. She saw resignation in some, hope in others, and the stark reality of fear in a few. All of it was necessary, all of it was real, and all of it was part of the process. She closed her laptop gently, the sound almost imperceptible, yet heavy with significance. "We are halfway through the flight," she said softly, "and this is only the beginning." Passengers settled back, a mix of awe, apprehension, and quiet determination settling in their expressions. The cabin, once a place of simple transit, had become a crucible, and Naomi, calm and resolute, was at its center, not as a tyrant, but as a conductor orchestrating the first notes of profound systemic change. As the flight continued, Naomi's mind drifted briefly to the personal costs, the sacrifices she had made to get here, every sleepless night, every battle fought, every door slammed in her face. It had all led to this. Yet, even with victory within reach, she recognized the endless nature of the work. Justice, once awakened, demanded constant vigilance, and she was ready. Passengers whispered among themselves, some recording, some reflecting, some daring to imagine a world where accountability was immediate, transparent, and unwavering. Naomi's gaze softened as she watched, understanding that the ripples of today's flight would extend far beyond the tarmac, beyond the corporate offices, beyond even the skies themselves. The cabin lights dimmed further, the drone of the engines a steady companion. Naomi leaned back, fingers lightly interlaced, her expression serene yet unreadable. Inside, she processed the tension, the fear, the hope, and the resolve that coexisted in everyone around her. She allowed herself a rare smile, a silent acknowledgement that the moment, however fleeting, was powerful, and the fight for systemic change, like the endless sky outside, stretched infinitely ahead. The cabin was silent, but the silence felt heavy, charged, as though the air itself held its breath. Naomi Sinclair leaned slightly forward in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the tray table. Each passenger seemed to feel the gravity of the moment, their own thoughts vibrating against the walls of the fuselage. She allowed herself a brief scan, taking in the subtle gestures, the half-hidden expressions, the tension held in clenched jaws and crossed arms. Richard Calloway shifted uncomfortably in 4A, his eyes darting around as though seeking an escape that didn't exist. Naomi's calm authority had changed the dynamic completely. He realized now that his usual tools of intimidation, manipulation, and entitled bluster were ineffective here. She didn't need to shout or threaten. The mere presence of her composure made him feel exposed. His thoughts raced with denial, anger, and a reluctant recognition of his own accountability. The flight attendants, led by Clara Jensen, exchanged nervous glances. They had been complicit, even if indirectly, and now the weight of scrutiny pressed down on them. Each movement, each hesitation, felt amplified in Naomi's presence. Clara's internal voice screamed that she should defend herself, make excuses, shift blame, but her instincts knew the futility of resistance. Naomi was unshakable, and the only choice was to confront truth directly or crumble under it. Naomi raised her voice, calm but firm, addressing Richard without a trace of personal animosity. "Mr. Calloway, you have had every opportunity to act with integrity. Today, you chose entitlement. But this is not a moment for humiliation. It is a moment for accountability. And accountability is not delayed by discomfort or ego." Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Words that might have carried authority evaporated in the face of Naomi's steady gaze. She was not merely confronting him. She was exposing a systemic pattern, showing him how his actions rippled outward, affecting crew, passengers, and the culture of the airline itself. From the back of the cabin, murmurs grew among the passengers. Some nodded in quiet approval, some whispered to their neighbors, and a few, unable to conceal their unease, cast sidelong glances at Richard. Naomi had transformed the cabin into a space of reflection and confrontation without raising her voice, without the need for theatrics. The weight of her presence alone compelled attention and introspection. Dana Cooper, seated near the front, swallowed hard. Naomi's words resonated with her in ways she had not anticipated. Each sentence was a mirror, reflecting the habits and biases she had long ignored or rationalized. She felt the sting of recognition and a desire to do better, to make amends in ways that extended beyond this flight. The moment felt both intimate and public, a rare convergence of personal accountability and societal observation. Naomi shifted slightly, her gaze sweeping the cabin once more. She caught the eye of a mother holding a fidgeting toddler in 3C. The woman's expression was a mixture of apprehension and admiration. Naomi offered a small, reassuring smile, silently acknowledging the shared humanity in the room. This was not just a confrontation with entitlement. It was an opportunity to model courage, integrity, and calm leadership in the face of conflict. Richard's inner turmoil intensified. He could no longer rely on privilege or status. The cabin had become a microcosm of justice, and Naomi's authority was rooted in competence, moral clarity, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. He felt trapped, not physically, but psychologically. Every glance from Naomi reminded him that his actions had consequences, and that this was not a scenario he could control with charm or aggression. Naomi turned her attention to the crew. Clara, Megan, and Dana. I am not here to punish you. I am here to guide a necessary intervention. Mistakes happen, systems fail, bias occurs, but acknowledgement and action can prevent harm. That is what this moment is about. That is what leadership requires. Clara Jensen swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had expected confrontation, but not this level of introspection. Naomi's presence demanded honesty, reflection, and a willingness to embrace change. Clara felt a surge of gratitude beneath the fear, a rare sense that her mistakes could be a foundation for growth rather than a permanent stain. Megan, Riley's hands clenched in her lap. She felt a whirlwind of guilt and relief. The exposure of her complicity was humiliating. Yet, Naomi's calm approach made her feel supported in confronting her own failures. She realized that accountability did not need to be punitive to be transformative. This was the lesson that Naomi imparted without a single raised voice. True authority comes from integrity, not fear. Naomi's mind, however, was not free from doubt. She allowed herself a brief moment to acknowledge the fatigue pressing against her chest. The weight of responsibility was immense. Hundreds of lives were interwoven in this cabin, each influenced by the actions, decisions, and biases she was navigating. She thought of countless others, outside this plane, who had endured similar injustices without anyone to intervene. She drew on her own internal reservoir of strength, reminding herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, more deliberate. Passengers were leaning forward, some whispering to their neighbors, others nodding quietly. Naomi recognized the power of witness. The collective attention of hundreds of people amplified the moral significance of the moment. This was not merely about Richard or the crew. This was a lesson in accountability, empathy, and leadership played out in real time. A lesson that could ripple far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Richard attempted to speak again, but his words were halting, fragmented. Naomi listened patiently, her eyes unwavering, letting him struggle without interruption. In her silence, she created space for reflection, forcing him to confront the futility of his defensiveness. He finally exhaled sharply, the fight draining from him in a slow, reluctant surrender. Naomi seized the moment. Accountability is not about shame. It is about clarity. It is about understanding the impact of our actions and committing to do better. You have seen it today. Now, it is your choice whether you step forward or step back. The path of integrity is not the easy one, but it is the one that allows trust, respect, and change to flourish. For the first time since the conflict began, the tension in the cabin shifted. The passengers were no longer passive observers. They were participants in a moment of moral reckoning. Some recorded, some reflected. Some silently resolved to act differently in their own lives. Naomi had turned the airplane into a microcosm of accountability, and the lesson was both immediate and enduring. As the flight continued, Naomi allowed herself a brief pause, her mind whirling with the intensity of the encounter. She thought of all the future flights, all the future passengers who would never know her name, yet who might feel the ripple of today's courage. She reminded herself that the smallest actions, taken in the right moment, could cascade into change far greater than one could ever anticipate. Naomi glanced at her watch, noting the time until descent. The cabin lights dimmed for mid-flight adjustment, casting gentle shadows across faces that were now more alert, more thoughtful, more engaged. She knew the work was not finished. There would be conversations after landing, emails, reports, and potentially disciplinary actions. But the foundation was laid. A moment of accountability had become a catalyst for reflection and, she hoped, lasting change. The hum of the engines filled the pauses between thoughts, a steady reminder that they were still airborne, still moving toward a shared destination, still bound together by circumstance and choice. Naomi leaned back slightly, allowing herself a rare private breath, her mind already considering the next steps, the strategies to ensure that today's lesson would not fade into the noise of ordinary life. In the midst of high-altitude tension, Naomi Sinclair embodied calm authority, moral clarity, and resilience. Her internal battle was mirrored by the external reckoning unfolding around her. Each person in the cabin faced a choice, and the ripple of that choice had begun. She had guided them, confronted them, and yet allowed space for individual reflection. The moment was far from over, but its significance would linger, carried by each witness, and by the subtle shifts in perspective she had ignited. The plane felt different now. The tension that had gripped the cabin like a vice began to shift, evolving into a strange mixture of respect, curiosity, and quiet contemplation. Naomi Sinclair remained seated, composed yet radiant with an authority that did not need to be announced. Every movement she made was deliberate, measured, and purposeful, signaling to the crew and passengers alike that control and clarity had returned. Richard Calloway slumped in his seat, a man stripped of the entitlement that had previously insulated him. He stared blankly out the window, the horizon blurred by altitude and perhaps by the fog of his own realization. Naomi's intervention had illuminated the emptiness of his bravado. There was no place for it here, and nowhere on this plane would it be tolerated. The cabin had become a mirror, reflecting the consequences of unchecked privilege and bias. Clara Jensen moved slowly down the aisle, adjusting her uniform and smoothing her hair. The previous panic had dissipated, replaced by a solemn awareness. She glanced at Naomi, who gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement. That gesture carried weight far beyond the exchange of words. It was an invitation to reflect, to correct, and to understand the responsibility inherent in her position. Clara felt a mix of relief and shame. She had been complicit in Richard's actions, but now she had a chance to make amends, to align her conduct with integrity rather than fear or deference. Passengers began to relax in small increments, though many remained visibly attentive. There were whispers exchanged in the rows behind Naomi, passengers quietly analyzing the events they had just witnessed. Some felt relief that justice had been visibly served. Others felt discomfort at recognizing patterns of behavior that might resonate with their own experiences. The power of observation had turned each witness into a participant in a subtle, yet transformative lesson about morality, empathy, and accountability. Megan Riley approached Naomi, her expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Thank you," she murmured softly, "for showing us another way." Naomi's lips curved into a small smile, warm yet professional. She understood the unspoken weight in Megan's words. It was not just gratitude, but a recognition that change was possible, even in a place as constrained and hierarchical as the cabin of an airplane. Naomi allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, closing her eyes for a heartbeat. The internal struggle that had simmered throughout the confrontation surfaced once more. She acknowledged the exhaustion, the constant vigilance required to navigate such situations, and the lingering weight of responsibility. In her mind, she replayed the moments of hesitation, the subtle choices she had made, and the quiet strategies that had allowed her to assert authority without aggression. She reminded herself that strength was not loud or theatrical. It was rooted in patience, empathy, and moral clarity. Richard finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. I understand," he stammered. "I see what I did, and I'm sorry." Naomi's gaze did not waver. She had expected this response, or some variation of it, yet her calm remained unshaken. The apology, though hesitant, was a necessary first step toward accountability. Richard's acknowledgement of his wrongdoing marked the beginning of the visible consequences for his actions. Naomi shifted her attention to the rest of the crew. We are all accountable, in some way, for the environment we create. Bias, negligence, hesitation in the face of injustice. These are things we must confront, regardless of discomfort. Today has been difficult, but it has also been instructive. Let this be a precedent for every decision you make moving forward. Her voice carried not condemnation, but expectation. She demanded responsibility, but she also offered the possibility of growth, a chance for the crew to rise to the occasion and align themselves with fairness and integrity. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the safety card in the seat pocket. She had internalized Naomi's words, the lessons resonating in ways that textbooks or training sessions never could. She realized that accountability was not abstract. It was enacted in moments like this, where choices had tangible consequences for others. The weight of understanding settled heavily on her shoulders, but it was accompanied by clarity, the knowledge that she could act differently next time. Passengers' reactions varied. Some exchanged approving nods, a subtle solidarity forming among those who had witnessed the confrontation. Others sat in reflective silence, digesting the implications for themselves and the world beyond the aircraft. The cabin had transformed into a living classroom, a microcosm of justice and moral reckoning, guided by Naomi's steady hand. Naomi caught sight of a young man sitting near the middle of the plane, his notebook open, pen hovering hesitantly. He scribbled something quickly, then paused, looking up at her briefly before resuming. She recognized the hunger for understanding in his eyes, the desire to grasp the lessons unfolding in real time. This was the true ripple effect of accountability, the way it sparked thought, reflection, and potential change in the minds of witnesses. Richard fidgeted in his seat, attempting to reconcile his ego with the reality of public exposure. He had been used to command, influence, and immediate deference. None of that applied here. He understood that the incident would not remain contained. The witnesses, the crew, and the cabin's dynamics had already begun to record and replay the narrative, spreading awareness in ways he could not control. Naomi's inner voice reminded her that this was not about vengeance. It was about correction, integrity, and structural accountability. She reflected briefly on her own journey, the moments when she had been underestimated, dismissed, or ignored. She drew on those experiences, channeling empathy for those who faltered, yet refusing to excuse the harm caused. Her calm demeanor and deliberate action had reshaped the cabin, reinforcing the principle that authority rooted in competence and moral clarity was far more powerful than intimidation or entitlement. The flight attendants began to move with renewed purpose. Clara adjusted her service cart quietly, attending to passengers with a careful attentiveness. Megan assisted a nervous passenger in 5C with a smile that conveyed both reassurance and quiet confidence. Their behavior had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, demonstrating that accountability could be transformative, not punitive. Naomi finally allowed herself a small, private sigh. The confrontation had ended, but the work of reflection, communication, and accountability would continue long after the plane touched down. She glanced out the window, the endless sky stretching beyond the horizon, and felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Moments of crisis revealed character not just hers, but everyone's in the cabin. Today had been one such moment. Passengers began to settle more comfortably into their seats. Conversations resumed, quieter and more contemplative than before. The cabin was still charged with emotion, but it was no longer oppressive. Naomi had shifted the balance, demonstrating that dignity, patience, and moral clarity could shape outcomes far more effectively than aggression or entitlement. As the flight continued, Naomi's mind lingered on the lessons of the day. Each interaction, each glance, each response had been an opportunity to teach and to learn. She felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the ripple effect of her actions would extend beyond the immediate cabin, inspiring thought, reflection, and potentially even change in the world beyond the airplane. Passengers glanced at one another, sharing small, meaningful expressions, a nod, a smile, a whispered comment. Naomi recognized that these tiny interactions were the building blocks of collective awareness. Justice, empathy, and accountability were contagious in their own quiet way. The cabin had been transformed, and the flight itself had become a narrative of learning, reflection, and moral growth. In her seat, Naomi closed her eyes briefly, feeling the plane glide through the clouds. She reflected on the journey, both literal and metaphorical. Challenges would arise, biases would surface, and mistakes would be made, but the key lay in response. how one acted, how one corrected, how one maintained integrity under pressure, these were the defining factors of character. She had witnessed and enacted this truth today. Richard remained in his seat, subdued, facing the consequences of his choices. Clara and Megan continued to serve, each action infused with the lessons of accountability, and Naomi, steady and composed, remained the anchor of the cabin, the quiet but undeniable force guiding every thought, every decision, every ripple of understanding. The plane carried on through the sky, a vessel of transformation, reflection, and moral reckoning. And Naomi Sinclair, seated at the center of it all, knew that the impact of this flight would extend far beyond the confines of the aircraft, into lives, perspectives, and the consciousness of everyone who had borne witness. The final descent was quieter than the initial turbulence, the hum of the engines now almost meditative. Naomi Sinclair remained seated in her first-class seat, her posture composed, the faintest curve of a satisfied smile gracing her lips. The cabin no longer held the anxious, restless energy of before. Instead, it was suffused with a tentative calm, as if each passenger had been gently nudged to reconsider assumptions, behaviors, and the subtle dynamics of privilege that often go unnoticed. Richard Calloway sat rigidly, staring at the seat back in front of him. The weight of the flight pressed down with a force that no seatbelt could restrain. He had attempted to maintain his usual bravado, but the events of the past hour had stripped him bare. Naomi's quiet authority, her unshakable composure in the face of his aggression, had unveiled the hollowness of his entitlement. He now confronted the truth he had long avoided: actions have consequences, and respect is not inherited, it is earned. Clara Jensen moved silently through the cabin, restoring order, offering assistance, and recalibrating her own sense of professional integrity. She had faced her own complicity, the moments when fear or convenience had allowed bias to go unchecked. Now, she had been given a chance to act differently, to embody the lessons that Naomi's presence had imparted. There was a humility in her movements, a subtle acknowledgement that responsibility extends beyond protocol and procedure. It reaches into character. Passengers whispered quietly to one another, their observations ranging from admiration to introspection. Many were recording, some surreptitiously, others openly. Each smartphone held the potential to amplify the events, spread an awareness far beyond the confines of this flight. Naomi understood this. She also understood the gravity of visibility, the opportunity to model behavior, to demonstrate strength and dignity in the face of injustice, and to catalyze meaningful reflection in those who had been passive observers. Megan Riley paused to offer Naomi a gentle nod of recognition. The unspoken message carried weight gratitude for leadership, for calm in chaos, and for the courage to assert ethical clarity where many would have faltered. Naomi responded with a brief, knowing smile. She had never sought applause, yet she understood the subtle power of acknowledgement in shaping culture, both within the cabin and beyond. The plane touched down smoothly at the terminal. There was a soft, collective exhale from passengers, a release of tension that had been tightly wound for the entirety of the flight. Naomi remained seated until the final safety announcements concluded, a silent anchor in a cabin that had transformed from chaos to contemplation. The crew prepared for disembarkation with a newfound attentiveness, their eyes reflecting lessons learned under pressure. As passengers stood, Naomi observed their behaviors with quiet acuity. Some approached her directly, expressing thanks or asking questions about her work, their curiosity ignited by the confidence and clarity she had demonstrated. Others lingered in reflection, their thoughts swirling in private contemplation about what they had witnessed and how it applied to their own lives. The flight had become more than a journey between two cities. It had become a microcosm of social dynamics, authority, and the consequences of actions rooted in bias or privilege. Richard rose slowly, his movement hesitant, almost apologetic. He approached Naomi with an air of cautious humility, aware that this moment demanded acknowledgement but uncertain how to navigate it. Naomi regarded him silently, her expression calm and measured. Words were unnecessary, the gravity of the situation was apparent, and her composed presence conveyed the message with clarity that no speech could replicate. Richard understood, and in that understanding, a subtle, though critical, transformation began. Clara Jensen, now walking alongside Naomi, adjusted her uniform and glanced at the passengers disembarking. She had witnessed the profound impact of ethical courage, of using authority responsibly, and of the power inherent in calm, deliberate action. For her, the flight had become a turning point, a lived lesson in accountability and integrity that textbooks and training manuals could never fully convey. She understood that moments like these, however fleeting, had the power to reshape professional culture and personal character simultaneously. Naomi's thoughts drifted to the young man in the middle rows, the one with the notebook. She hoped that the lesson he had observed would endure beyond these walls, beyond the terminal, and into the broader world. Witnessing ethical strength, integrity, and composed confrontation was a form of education that transcended traditional instruction. The ripple effects of today's flight would reach far beyond what anyone could immediately perceive. The crew completed final checks, ensuring that every passenger had safely disembarked. Naomi lingered slightly, offering quiet words of encouragement to Megan and Clara. Her tone was measured, her language precise, yet imbued with warmth. Integrity, she said softly, is not just about the moments when others are watching. It is about the choices we make when no one else notices, and about the courage to act rightly, even when uncomfortable. Passengers filed out, some lingering to offer brief acknowledgments. Naomi received them graciously, her calm authority unshaken by the attention. She understood the subtle responsibility she carried to model dignity, to assert fairness, and to catalyze reflection without resorting to spectacle. Each interaction reinforced the notion that leadership was most powerful when it inspired understanding rather than demanded submission. Richard, in a final act of contrition, approached the crew. His voice was low, measured, and infused with a tentative humility. "I will take this lesson with me," he said, his tone sincere. "I understand now what I failed to see before." Clara, hearing the words, nodded silently. The moment was small, yet significant, a microcosm of accountability, a recognition that even those who falter can begin the path toward rectification. Naomi watched him, observing not with triumph, but with quiet acknowledgement. The power of witnessing change, even incremental, was profound. It reinforced her belief in the transformative potential of calm authority, moral clarity, and patience. Her inner reflection acknowledged both fatigue and satisfaction. The flight had been an ordeal, yes, but it had also been an opportunity to illuminate injustice, to assert dignity, and to catalyze understanding in ways that extended far beyond the cabin walls. As Naomi gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, she allowed herself a small, private smile. The flight had concluded, but the journey, both for herself and for those who had witnessed the events, would resonate far longer. Lessons had been observed, accountability had been enacted, and the subtle but significant shifts in perception had begun. The cabin, once a space of tension and conflict, now held echoes of clarity, reflection, and understanding. Passengers exited into the terminal, the murmur of conversation a gentle counterpoint to the events that had unfolded. Naomi followed, her presence calm, measured, and quietly commanding. The day had been transformative, a reminder that courage, empathy, and unwavering integrity could assert themselves in even the most constrained spaces. The flight would be remembered, shared, and reflected upon a story of dignity under pressure, ethical clarity, and the subtle but powerful ripple effects of moral courage. Naomi stepped into the terminal, drawing a deep breath, feeling the shift in the air. She knew the challenges would continue, that similar situations would arise in the future. But she also knew that the precedent had been set. Authority rooted in empathy, patience, and moral clarity had prevailed, reshaping the narrative and demonstrating that respect and accountability were not optional, they were essential. The passengers dispersed. The crew returned to their routines, and Naomi made her way to the exit, leaving behind a cabin subtly transformed, a story indelibly marked into the consciousness of all who had been present. Today had been about much more than a stolen seat. It had been about asserting dignity, confronting bias, and demonstrating that true power lies in measured action, empathy, and unwavering moral courage. And as Naomi walked into the sunlight of the terminal, the final thought that crossed her mind was simple yet profound. The smallest acts of integrity can resonate the farthest, and even in spaces as confined as an airplane cabin, justice, empathy, and dignity can prevail. As the cabin emptied and the engines cooled, the echoes of Naomi Sinclair's quiet resilience lingered in every corner. Passengers, crew, and even those who tried to wield entitlement now carried a deeper understanding, dignity. Fairness and empathy are not negotiable, they are essential. Naomi's calm authority didn't just restore order, it reshaped perspectives, igniting reflection on the small, often unnoticed moments where bias and privilege creep in. This story reminds us that standing firm in the face of injustice takes courage, patience, and moral clarity. It asks us to look inward. How would we act if confronted with inequality, disrespect, or cruelty? How do we ensure that our actions uplift rather than diminish the humanity of others? The lessons of this flight will linger far beyond the airport gates. They challenge us to honor those who act with integrity, to question systemic injustice, and to embrace the quiet power of self-respect. Naomi's journey isn't just her own, it's a call for all of us to reconsider how we navigate the world around us, how we confront bias, and how we champion justice, even in the smallest spaces. If this story moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. More stories of courage, reflection, and justice await, and Naomi's example is only the beginning.